Welcome to the New York State Justice Center webinar for mandated reporters. This webinar is to provide mandated reporters with an overview of their legal duties under the New York State Protection of People with Special Needs Act. Under this law, you are required to report abuse, neglect, and significant incidents involving vulnerable persons, and you'll make these reports to the Vulnerable Person Central Register, also known as the VPCR. This is a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week hotline operated by the Justice Center for the Protection of People with Special Needs. And the effective date of this new reporting requirement is June 30th, 2013. During this webinar, we're going to cover a lot of ground, including who mandated reporters are and what they're required to report. We'll also look at when they're required to report and who vulnerable persons are under the Act. We'll also look at the facilities and programs that are covered. We'll also look at what constitutes abuse or neglect and what constitutes a significant incident that also must be reported. We'll look at what happens when a report is made to the VPCR and what protections and liabilities you have as a mandated reporter. Finally, we'll let you know how to get more information should you have any questions. What are mandated reporters required to report? Effective June 30th, 2013, mandated reporters have a legal duty to do the following. To report to the Justice Center if they have a reasonable cause to suspect that abuse or neglect has taken place involving a vulnerable person. This includes a child receiving residential services in a facility or from a provider. These reports must be made by calling the VPCR hotline at 1-855-373-2122. Certain mandated reporters may also submit their reports by completing a form that's available on the Justice Center website, but the preferred method is to call the hotline. You'll also have to report any significant incidents to the Justice Center. Make these reports also by calling the hotline or by completing the form on the Justice Center's website. Mandated reporters are either custodians or human service professionals. In the case of custodians, these include employees, volunteers, directors, and operators of covered facilities and programs. Also, external staff who have regular and substantial contact with the people being served. Like the child abuse reporting law, mandated reporters for vulnerable persons are human service professionals who, in their normal workday, may have a reason to suspect that a vulnerable person has been subjected to abuse or neglect. However, the law also specifies that custodians are mandated reporters. Mandated reporters also include a wide range of human service professionals, as you can see from this list. They range from child care and foster care workers to medical professionals and law enforcement officials. If you have any question or any doubt as to whether or not you are a mandated reporter, contact the Justice Center for more information. You'll also need to provide the name and address of the agency, facility, and/or program where the incident took place. Confirmation that immediate protections have been made for the victim if that is applicable, and any other information that may assist with the investigation or review of the incident. You should note, mandated reporters are required to notify the VPCR even if they do not have all of this information at the time they report the incident. Reporting is required whenever a mandated reporter has a reasonable cause to suspect that a reportable incident has involved a vulnerable person, and you're required to make that report to the VPCR immediately upon discovery. Now, reasonable cause means that based on your observations, training, and experience, you have a suspicion that a vulnerable person has been subjected to abuse or neglect. Significant incidents that may place a vulnerable person at risk of harm must also be reported to the VPCR. Reasonable cause can be as simple as doubting the explanation that you were given for a vulnerable person's injury. The key idea is this, that if a mandated reporter has reason or concern about abuse, neglect, or significant incidents involving a vulnerable person, he or she should contact the Vulnerable Persons Central Register. Immediately means right away. However, reporting may be delayed to prevent harm to the individual for as long as it takes to call emergency responders and/or address the need to maintain safety and supervision, for example. Staff going off duty does not justify a reporting delay. In any event, reports must be made to the VPCR within 24 hours of discovery of an incident. The first priority is to always address the well-being of the vulnerable persons involved. The second priority, once safety concerns have been addressed, is to contact the VPCR. Once time has been taken to ensure that vulnerable persons have received medical care and/or continuous supervision, the VPCR must be called immediately thereafter. Upon discovery means when you witness an incident or situation of abuse or neglect, or when the vulnerable person or another individual comes to you and the available information they provide indicates reasonable cause of abuse or neglect. Remember, reporting to the VPCR is an additional reporting requirement and does not relieve mandated reporters of any other reporting requirements or duties that may be required by law, regulation, or policy. Again, whatever actions are required by your origination or state oversight agency must still be performed. Who else should report? Well, that would be anyone who has a reasonable cause to suspect that a reportable incident involving a vulnerable person has taken place. They should also call the VPCR immediately. And if a mandated reporter or any other person has doubts about whether the available information indicates a reasonable cause of abuse or neglect, they should still call the VPCR. Who are vulnerable persons? The Act defines a vulnerable person as a person who, due to physical or cognitive disabilities or the need for services or placement, is receiving care from a facility or provider within the systems of the state oversight agencies. Also covered by the Act are adult homes licensed by the Department of Health that have over 80 beds and where at least 25% of the residents are persons diagnosed with a serious mental illness and have fewer than 55% of the beds designated as Assisted Living Program beds, or ALPs. It also includes overnight summer day and travel summer day camps for children with developmental disabilities under the jurisdiction of the DOH. Also included are the New York State School for the Blind, the New York State School for the Deaf, state-supported schools that have residential components, special act school districts, and in-state private residential schools approved by the New York State Education Department. If you have any questions about whether you or your program or facility are covered, you should contact your employer or your state oversight agency that licenses or operates the program. Also covered by the Act are facilities and programs operated by the Office of Children and Family Services for youths placed in the custody of the Commissioner of OCFS. OCFS licensed or certified residential facilities that care for abandoned, abused, neglected, and dependent children, persons in need of supervision or juvenile delinquents, family-type homes for adults, OCFS certified runaway and homeless youth programs, and finally, OCFS certified youth detention facilities. As a mandated reporter, you'll also want to know what your obligations are to notify law enforcement. You should immediately call law enforcement if you think a possible crime has been committed. If law enforcement has not already been called when a report is received by the VPCR, staff can consult with supervisors to decide if local police should also be contacted. The Act defines abuse and neglect of vulnerable persons in broad terms, including both actual harm and the risk of harm. They include physical abuse, and this would include intentional contact such as hitting, kicking, or shoving, corporal punishment, injuries which cannot be explained and are suspicious due to the extent or location of the injuries, the number of injuries at one time, or the frequency of injuries over time. It also includes psychological abuse. This includes taunting, name-calling, using threatening words or gestures. To be clear, these are only examples. It's not possible to cover the entire range of situations that are related to abuse, neglect, and significant incidents, all of which need to be reported to the VPCR. Abuse or neglect also includes sexual abuse. This would include inappropriate touching, indecent exposure, sexual assault, taking or distributing sexually explicit pictures, voyeurism or other sexual exploitation. All sexual contact between a custodian and a service recipient is considered sexual abuse, unless the custodian is also a person receiving services. Abuse or neglect also obviously includes neglect. This is failure to provide supervision or adequate food, clothing, shelter, health care, or access to educational entitlement. Also covered is deliberate misuse of restraint or seclusion. Use of these interventions with excessive force as a punishment or for the convenience of staff is considered abuse. Also, controlled substances. Using, administering, or providing any controlled substance contrary to law is considered abuse under the law. The final two categories of what constitutes abuse or neglect are aversive conditioning and obstruction. Aversive conditioning is unpleasant physical stimulus used to modify behavior without person-specific legal authorization. And obstruction is identified as interfering with the discovery, reporting, or investigation of abuse or neglect, falsifying records, or intentionally making false statements. What constitutes a significant incident? New York state law also recognizes that vulnerable persons can be harmed or put at risk in many types of circumstances. The Act defines a significant incident as an incident that is not abuse or neglect, but has the potential to result in harm to the health, safety, or welfare of a person receiving services. Examples may include, but are not limited to, the following: the use of restraint when it is avoidable, involving a banned technique, or is used by inadequately trained staff; unauthorized seclusion or timeout, and harmful interactions between vulnerable persons that could reasonably have been prevented. Examples may also include administration of a medication contrary to a medical order that results in an adverse impact. And finally, any other conduct identified in regulations of the state oversight agency or according to guidelines or standards established by the Justice Center. What happens when a report is made to the VPCR? First, a trained staff person from the VPCR will take a full report over the phone or via a web form. Then, based on the information provided, the VPCR will categorize the reportable incident as either abuse, neglect, or a significant incident. The VPCR will then notify the appropriate SOA. And finally, the Justice Center will be responsible for ensuring that the reportable incident is investigated or reviewed by the appropriate entity. What protections and liabilities do mandated reporters have? Immunity from liability is one of the protections. The law grants immunity to mandated reporters and other reporters from any legal claims which may arise from a good faith act of providing information to the VPCR. There's also protection from retaliatory personnel action. The law prohibits an employer or agency from taking any retaliatory personnel action against a person as a result of a good faith act of providing information to the VPCR. Mandated reporters also have confidentiality. The law provides protections against the disclosure of a reporter's identity subject to limited exceptions, such as the reporter's consent or a court order. However, there is a liability for a failure to report. Failure by a mandated reporter to report suspected abuse or neglect to the VPCR is a serious matter, and possible consequences include administrative discipline, termination, civil liability, and criminal prosecution. Remember, in addition to giving mandated reporters legal duties, it also provides them with legal protections for making reports to the VPCR in good faith. If you need more information or have questions about your role as a mandated reporter, contact the Justice Center at 1-518-549-0200. Again, that's 1-518-549-0200. We'll be pleased to answer any questions you may have.